In this video, we're going to look at the construction process for 3 different seams. I like to show you the seams that we're going to do the samples of in ready to wear before you work the samples so that you can refer back to them while you're working the samples. The first one I want to show you is the French seam. And the French seam we'll learn is worked in delicate or sheer fabrics. And we see that in this blouse. And this is a delicate piece of silk. This is one of the vintage pieces from our collection of vintage clothes. And you can see that the side seam and the underarm seams were worked using the French seam construction process. So this is the French seam. And then the next seam that we'll look at is the flat fell seam. You see this in denim, like in the legs of your blue jeans, the side seam of your jean jacket maybe. We see it in this blouse and in a lot of blouse construction. And it's done in the side seam. You see 2 rows of stitches, and then there's no seam allowance that is exposed on the back side. So this is an example of the flat fell seam that we'll be making. And then the last thing I want to show you is top stitching. And this is a great example of top stitching. You have all kinds of top stitching around the sleeve placket, down the front. On the pocket, there's top stitching. On the collar. So you see top stitching in a lot of different places. And this top stitching is done in a contrasting thread, and so it shows up really easily to see. So a French seam, a flat fell seam, and a top stitch seam is what we'll be doing in these videos. We're going to look at the top stitched seam, and you see top stitching in everything you wear in all different kinds of places, and we'll look at that in a minute. But we're going to do two versions of a top stitch. We're going to do a single top stitch on the right side and then a double top stitch on the left side. What I want you to notice even before we get started is what you have to be careful of. If you look, the whole thing about top stitching is keeping them straight. So going slow enough. You see how this kind of wiggle woggles all over everywhere. So this is not a very good example of top stitching, what not to do. And then this is a little bit better. It's not very pretty, the orange and green together, but it's a straighter seam. So we'll look at how we're going to do that. What you're going to do is cut one of your squares in half and do your 5/8 inch seam down the length, and then we're going to press it open. And we're going to pretend like this is pressed open, but you will want to actually press it open, and pressing is actually pretty important because it will help it lay flat. All right, so when you top stitch, sometimes you want to make, if you notice on your jeans, it's a little bit longer stitch. So your machine automatically sets on 2.5. So we might want to bump it up even, oops, wrong one. We might want to bump that stitch length all the way up to 3. And that's going to make a prettier top stitch, but certainly that is the designer's choice or the stitcher's choice. The other thing about top stitching is using something to help you keep it straight. You can't use the markings on the plate of the machine because they're covered up. So what you have to rely on is the presser foot. And you see there's a little notch in the middle, and then there's the 2 edges. So you can use any of those 3 things to help you line up the row of stitches and keep them straight. The other beautiful thing about this machine is you can come back over here and you can move the needle. So let's say it's really comfortable for you to use the middle, the little slit in the middle lined up with the middle seam, but that you want your top stitching offset just a little bit. So maybe we would bump it over to 3 and see how that would work. So let's do that. We've got our needle bumped over 1 notch, and then we've lengthen the stitches to 3, and let's see what we get when we do that. So we're just going to watch carefully that everything stays straight as we sew down through here. Not watching the needle. They say if you watch the needle, your eye goes crazy. So you don't want to watch the needle, you just want to watch the seam. All right. So that looks pretty good. It's really close to the edge. I might want to have bumped it over again to another, to maybe 4, but it is straight and it's right by the edge. So this will be our row of 2. So now I'm going to line it up again with the center, but I am going to bump it over 2 more to get that wider, or 3 even, to get that second row of stitches a little bit further over. So again, I'm using the middle, oops, I'm bunching up here. There we go. Lining that seam up with the middle, and these are going to be really close, which is not a bad thing. It's just how it worked out on this. So you want to play with it and see what you, ooh, this is not looking good at all. We'll see how this looks. I think this is going to be another bad example, but just bad when I got down here. Right here, this little section looks pretty good. You see how the stitches are parallel, but they're close, and maybe that's what you want, and that's just fine. So this part of this sample is great. This is not so good, and this is not so good. It takes a lot of practice. All right, now let's do a single row of top stitching. This time we'll line it up with the edge of the presser foot and the seam that we made initially. So we'll leave, so my presser foot is my needle is swung way over. I think I'll bring it back maybe to right there, and we'll see what this looks like. Coming down through here, again, trying to keep our eye on that edge of that presser foot. Let's see. That looks pretty good. So this is the single row of top stitching, and it looks, if you disregard the one on the left, it looks pretty consistent, so that's nice, and it's straight, and I like the length, so that one looks good if you wanted a single row. And then I would need to redo this one because it really doesn't look very good. But on the this sample, it doesn't look so bad, and it's a little bit wider. It just shows you how you just choose if you want the two narrow rows, or if you want a little bit spaced apart. So that's top stitching. This is a flat fell seam, and you see this a lot of times in denim, on a jean jacket. Sometimes it's on the leg of your jeans or the side seam of your jacket. Sometimes it's in a construction of a shirt or a blouse, but it's called a flat fell seam. And as you can see, there's no exposed seam allowance. The seam allowance is caught up in the seam. So we're going to look at the steps involved with the flat fell seam. What we're going to do is take your square, we're going to cut it in half, and you're going to do a 5/8 inch seam down the long edge. Then you're going to press that open, which I have done this time. I press the seam open, and we want to trim away one side of the seam. So I've started doing that. I'll finish trimming that away. All right, so this is our short seam. Now we're going to go to the ironing board, and we're going to fold this seam allowance over, fold it in half, and then fold it over again. But we want to press that because then we're going to top stitch it. So let's go to the ironing board and press those two things down. So now we're at the ironing board, and we have this pressed flat, and we've trimmed away more than half of the seam allowance on one side, and we want to press the remaining seam allowance over to where the raw edge is right in next to that seam that you just made when you sewed it initially. So we're going to use the tip of the iron and careful fingers and press that over. This fabric is nice and cooperative and kind of behaves when you put it where you want it. So a good one to show you. All right, then we're going to fold it over one more time and press it flat. So now all the raw edges are in the middle of the seam, but we're going to press it flat so that we can go back and top stitch it. So it doesn't hurt even to get a little shot of steam. Make it lay down good and flat. We'll put a few pins in there, and now we're ready to do the second row of stitches right along this edge. So I did realize I want to make sure you understood that this back side we want to be perfectly flat as well. I felt a little pucker when I was pinning it, but you notice that that is a flat seam. Then from the front where we've pressed, it's a good idea to put a couple of pins just to hold things so that they don't shift while you're sewing. So we're going to sew right next to that folded edge, and again, it's the designer or the stitcher's choice as to how far over you want to come. But you can look on ready to wear and kind of get an idea about what they do in the actual clothing industry. So I am going to line up that folded edge with the inside edge of my presser foot right here, and use that as a guide to make sure, because it is critical that it stays straight. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to look and see where my needle comes down, and I'm in a bit, so I'm going to probably bump my my needle back over a little bit closer to the edge. We'll see how this looks. It can always be picked out. I like the longer stitch length, so I'm going to leave it at 3. All right. And I'm just watching the edge of the presser foot and the edge of the folded edge of the fabric as I go down through here. Too bad. It's green and the other is blue, but it is right there beside that edge. So you could have come over a little bit more, but it gets the job done, and this is your flat fell seam. We're going to look at a French seam, and the French seam, we've got 2 different applications of the French seam. The French seam is great when you're working with sheer fabrics because it totally encases the seam allowance and looks really nice from the outside of the garment. On the inside, you notice that there's no raw edge. The seam allowance is hidden inside the seams that we're going to make as a part of the process of the French seam. So that's what that looks like, as opposed to, this is not a bad choice, but you see, if I chose to finish the seam with a serge, like what we did earlier, you can see the serge stitches from the wrong side, and it's just not quite as nice of an appearance. But this is better than a raw edge. That would look terrible because it would fray and look really messy. But a French seam is a great way to treat a seam if you've got a sheer fabric. And a delicate fabric is another place that you would use a French seam. I've used this fabric because part of the process of the French seam is starting with the wrong sides together, which is totally abnormal. So it's nice to work with a printed fabric so you can keep straight in your head, this is the right side and this is the wrong side. But this is the same seam, just worked on a print fabric. So we're going to start with a print fabric and do a 5/8 inch seam down the length, and then we're going to trim it. I've already trimmed it down. So we're going to trim down, and I may even trim it a little bit more. We're going to trim away a lot of this seam allowance. What you don't want to happen is to leave a seam allowance and have this happen. This is one that I worked, and you can see right here where I didn't trim very good, and so part of the threads are showing through from where I didn't trim it very well. That's not a good look. This is it either. Oh, this is even worse. This, you can see the seam allowance wasn't trimmed hardly at all, and so it sticks through. We don't want this at all. So this is what not to do. All right, so I've trimmed my seam allowance down to almost nothing, and now I'm going to press this flat and press it one more time. So we will move to the ironing board. Okay, so we've got the trimmed seam allowance. We're going to press it. What we want to do first is open this up and press it flat. So our seam allowance is going all together to one side. We want to use that tip of the iron and press really good and get a good flat piece of fabric. Now we're going to fold it in half. And if you made this flat, then it's not so hard to just fold it right in half and keep a good even amount of fabric to the left and to the right. So we don't want we don't want it to roll like, I'll show you, we don't want it to roll like this, where from this side you can see how the fabric wasn't pressed right on that seam and it rolled. That would not go well when you go to sew that seam. So we want it right on top of each other and flat. Good and flat, and now we're ready to go back and we're going to stitch our second row of stitches that will encase that seam allowance and finish out the French seam. So now we've pressed the seam back to cover up the seam allowance, and I've put a couple of pins just to hold everything so it doesn't shift while we're sewing or getting to the sewing machine. The other critical thing is we want this to add up to 5/8, so we don't want to take a really big seam allowance when we come back to do this second row of stitches. So even on the 1/4 inch seam, that should add up to about 5/8 and make everything work out right with your pattern. So we're going to stitch down through here, keeping our eye on the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have stitched that, and then there we go. It's all stuck there in the middle. So this is the French seam, and like I say, it's a great seam to use when it's a delicate fabric or when you don't want any seam allowance to show. And it's good to work it again with a print fabric so that you can get the whole idea of starting with the wrong sides together as opposed to starting with the right sides together, and then you end up sewing it with the right sides together like you would have normally sewn it. We just looked at 3 different seams. In the next video, we're going to look at closures.